Hello, I'm Dr. Scott Wadier.
And I'm Tommy Welling, and you're listening to the Fasting for Life podcast.
This podcast is about using fasting as a tool to regain your health, achieve ultimate wellness, and live the life you truly deserve.
Each episode is a short conversation on a single topic with immediate actionable steps. We cover everything from fat loss and health and wellness to the science of lifestyle design.
We started Fasting for Life because of how fasting has transformed our lives, and we hope to share the tools that we have learned along the way. Hey everyone, welcome to the Fasting for Life podcast. My name is Dr. Scott Wadier, and I'm here, as always, with my good friend and colleague, Tommy Welling. Good afternoon to you, sir.
Hey, Scott. How are you?
Fantastic, my friend. Excited for today's conversation. We are going to dive into the topic of cortisol and its effect on metabolic health. We are then going to talk about the relationship to insulin and insulin resistance. We're going to talk about, is the juice worth the squeeze when it comes to fasting? You're probably going to know the answer to that already. If you've been listening to us for a while, the answer is a resounding yes. And excited to unpack this. This is something that we see. We are not big social media folks. Tommy didn't have a Facebook account up until about a year ago. Mm-hmm. Mine, if you message me there, it might still be there. I'm not great at checking that. So we are not big in the social media world, but we do love our podcasting and our resources and coaching and challenges and everything else that we do.
Oh, yeah.
But the reason I say that is because we've seen a big influx of conversation around cortisol. Fasting a few years ago, when we started this podcast, we were one of just a handful. Now there's dozens, right? Then it was insulin resistance and blood sugar and CGMs. And now we're seeing this cortisol adrenal conversation. So we want to give you our perspective on it. So if you're new to the podcast, welcome in. Thank you for giving us a chance to be part of your fasting, weight loss, and health journey. You want to know more about us, head back to episode 1, give it a listen. It's a short explanation of how fasting transformed our lives and ultimately why we do this week in and week out. Shout out again to the OGs, the long-term listeners, the ones that send us these incredible testimonies of their transformations. Just a shout out to you and a shout out to everyone that's left us a review, good and bad. We, of course, prefer the 5-star kind, which luckily we have a lot of. So that tells us that we're talking about things that matter to you. And also those reviews help us out tremendously to tell the podcast gods and goddesses that we are doing something right and worthwhile. So welcome in to the podcast episode. We are going to be diving into cortisol's effect on metabolic health. All right, Tommy. Cortisol. Good, bad, or indifferent?
Yeah, well, it's necessary, right? It plays a lot of vital roles in the body for sure. But where things can go awry are when, like for me and you, early age glucocorticoids, where we're being administered exogenous cortisol-like substances in order to produce an anti-inflammatory effect and an immune suppressing effect, right? That can then leave a trail behind, apparently, for years and years and decades. And they didn't really understand that a long time ago. It's always kind of a known risk, but typically when those kind of things are acutely prescribed, therefore something serious that's going on. So it's one of those potential trade-offs. However, when the turmoil of insulin resistance starts at such a young age, it can then lead to weight gain, insulin resistance, deposition of visceral fat, along with HPA axis and cortisol imbalances that can then lead to further imbalances as life goes on, especially when these things are happening like prepubescent. And it can take a long time to kind of restore balance within the body. So cortisol definitely necessary, but we want to get as much balance as we can with cortisol, and we're going to see that with how cortisol relates to insulin and insulin resistance as well.
So what you're referring to there is when I had severe allergies and asthma growing up, and I was put on a series of prednisone, and Beclevent was, I believe, the steroid inhalant. And then I think Advair also had a steroid component to it.
Yeah, I had that one.
Yeah, which was the beginning of the insulin resistant cascade. Fast forward to the grad school years, to the restaurant years, to the new dad, practice owner, 80 hours a week years, to the I'll sleep when I'm dead years, to the mortgage payments and future college planning and private school years, paying for it all.
Stressful.
There's also the stress component too. So you'll hear, if you listen to us or you've been with us for any reasonable amount of time, we always talk about other drivers, and we just did a podcast episode this recently too, drivers of insulin resistance that aren't food related, right? So we talk a lot about the stress response and sleep cycles and the circadian rhythm. So when we look at cortisol is a major component or a major player in that equation as well. So you alluded to the external exogenous administering of steroids, or when you get a cortisone injection, if you're a diabetic, that's a big deal, because it is going to induce an insulin resistance and suppress insulin function to where your blood sugars can go up 200, 300, 400 points.
Wow.
And people don't realize this, right? So the medication component comes into play. But when we look at cortisol, it's been demonized. So, so many times, if people hear cortisol, they're like, oh, cortisol is bad, right? Well,
get a stress response from the stress hormone, just mentioning it.
Yep. Cortisol. Right?
Yeah.
Like, get out of here. Well, the reality is without cortisol, we'd be dead. Okay. So if we need it, it's a necessary component. Now, if we're talking in an acute short-term phase versus a chronic long-term phase, that's a different conversation. But it's known, like you said, for that stress response, right? At the right levels, it manages our sleep-wake cycle, helps combat inflammation, contribute. Well, what didn't you just say? Cortisone and all that stuff? Like, yeah, it helped, but it also created a problem with insulin, which is the second half of this conversation. So yes, it helps combat inflammation in the short term. It contributes to healthy metabolism and assists in regulating blood sugar acutely in a normal response to an acute stress, meaning short-term stress. It has all those positive benefits. Well, guess what? In a chronic situation, it's going to do the complete opposite. It's going to mess with our sleep-wake cycle. It's going to increase inflammation. It's going to tank our healthy metabolism, and it's going to wreak havoc on our blood sugar regulation. Well, how do I know if I'm stressed or not? That's a great question.
Or if you have high cortisol or not, even without stress.
Right? So if they're too low, you may have adrenal insufficiency. If they're too high, you're going to have things like Cushing's syndrome. So now we're talking about like medically diagnosed issues, right? So weight gain around your midsection, your face, wide reddish purple stretch marks, bruising, like that is an advanced severe category, right? But when we're talking,
the gradient, right? Which is oftentimes not talked about, which yes, for sure, Cushing's is on one side of the spectrum, way far down, away from most people. Most people aren't suffering from that. But at the same time, somewhere between my normal physiology and Cushing's syndrome might be some excess stretch marks, some level of low sex drive and low testosterone or low estrogen,
fatigue and weight gain at the waist, and
high visceral fat deposits, all of these things.
100%. So chronic high cortisol will keep blood sugar elevated, increasing insulin resistance. So insulin in itself is going to take the energy in the bloodstream and shuttle it into the cell so it can be used, specifically the muscle cells. And it'll lead to type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome. So this is a funny statement to say, but don't stress, even though cortisol is the stress hormone.
Right.
We're going to break down cortisol. What does it do? So, and how fasting, yes, does have a short-term increase in cortisol production, right? But long-term, the benefit and its effect on insulin far outweighs that short-term spike. And we'll get to that in just a few minutes. So cortisol, glucocorticoid, produced from the adrenal glands, HPA axis. It shuttles throughout your body. Almost every cell has a receptor for it. So it's going to regulate the stress response, your fight or flight. It's going to control your blood sugar levels because cortisol is counterbalancing to the effects of insulin.
That's
cortisol is going to elevate your blood sugar. Go ahead.
Yeah, you don't hear that talked about very much, counterbalancing the effect of insulin. But that one makes sense on a practical level. If you think about cortisol, like think of the wiring that we need to get away from a short-term acute threat. Like let's say a tiger, a mastodon, something like that. Then where do we need to go? We need to run. We need
I always
to
think
climb.
Megalodon, Sharknado, right? Isn't there a Megalodon or something? In Sharknado?
Yeah, there's got to be a Megalodon somewhere. We got to get away from. But
hold on. But the Megalodon of today's world is, you were just talking about this. You put your phone on the charger right before we hopped on this podcast and put it on Do Not Disturb. Yeah. And it just turned on. And you're like, no. I want you to charge. I don't want you to turn on. Yeah. And you're like, well, now it's on. And now I can see the notifications.
Right. Cortisol level just ticking up right there.
And we're over communicated and overstimulated and over highlight reeled with social media and over caffeinated and over. Life isn't any less stressful than it was when my dad used to walk in the snow uphill both ways to school back in the day. Right.
Yeah. It's just a different stress.
Yeah, it's a different stress, but we are way more distracted and stressed out and freaked out about things in today's world and connected than ever before. So yeah, the Megalodon's everywhere. Yeah, but the Megalodon or the Mastodon were kind of helpful in dissipating the stress response, because that meant that the stress response was shorter lived and more acute. Now that it's more chronic and prolonged over time without a way to really dissipate it, because unless we're burning through the fuel that gets mobilized from that stress response, it's going to continue. It's going to linger. And when we add insulin resistance to that, if you have excess weight or you've been trying to lose it for a long time, or you have any of the signs or symptoms of insulin resistance, go check out the insulin resistance assessment on the website under resources, thefastingforlife.com. Yep. When you have signs of insulin resistance, that means that you have more trouble dissipating that stress response. It's going to take longer. And if you're not burning through the fuel because of a physical stress, then it's just going to be basically elevated blood sugar and then thus elevated insulin for a more prolonged period of time because of that imbalanced stress response. So when we're talking about the relationship to metabolism, right, and metabolic health, right? Think of metabolic health as being able to lose weight, keep it off, prevent disease, reverse disease, get off medications, increase energy, living life to your fullest, right? Like we want a healthy metabolic function. So when we look at cortisol and its effect on metabolic health, there's a traditional, in its relationship, to insulin resistance. When we have an acute thing happen where our stress goes up, right? So that's then going to tell the HPA axis to tell the adrenals to release, it'll increase cortisol, which then you're going to have more glucose released into the bloodstream, right? So over time, that can lead to insulin resistance and abnormal cholesterol. Abnormal cholesterol is part of that, the five musketeers of metabolic syndrome, right? So when we have that process take place for a long period of time, stress, glucose, insulin. Now you're going to be in a high insulin state. So you're going to have the issues losing weight. You're not going to process, you're going to fear carbohydrates. You're going to have big energy swings, lots of cravings, right? Yeah. Over time, if you're chronically stressed, then your cortisol levels are actually going to drop from stage 1, stage 2 into stage 3, where your body goes, you know what? I don't even care about the Megalodon anymore. I can't deal with it anyway. Just don't care. Not going to do it. So then you don't produce cortisol. But guess what? Now you're you're insulin resistant because of those chronic stresses over time. So the long-term effect of high cortisol levels increases inflammation, like we talked about, chances of stroke, chronic respiratory disease, heart disorders, cancer, obesity, diabetes, because it directly will raise blood pressure, cholesterol, blood sugar levels, which are 3 of the 5 risk factors for metabolic syndrome or metabolic dysfunction. It also, Tommy, you mentioned it earlier, drives the accumulation of visceral fat, even without a caloric surplus, meaning even without being overfed.
Yeah, that's the trouble, because visceral fat is not directly related to macronutrients or to calories input into the or intaken into the body. Their visceral fat is driven by cortisol levels, and so the 1-2 punch here is that when we have either high insulin or high cortisol levels, these can lead to weight gain, to caloric storage rather than burning over time. And that's a problem. And when we put the two together, that's compounding the effect of both of those.
And not just caloric storage.
The worst kind.
Yeah, right. But the worst kind. But cortisol also triggers fat and carb metabolism, which in turn stimulates your appetite, which may lead you to overeat. Anyone out there, raise your hand if you're driving 2 hands on the wheel.
Right.
But you're virtually raising your hand, right?
Yeah.
Is anyone ever stress eat?
I've done it.
Yeah. It's well known that stressful things, people go to food to feel better. They go to that emotional connection to food.
Yeah, it's not just psychological though. It's physiological too. We can feel that rapid rise in blood sugar, which gets chased by a rise in insulin, which then leads to an overcompensating drop in blood sugar as insulin is having the effect that it needs to on the blood sugar. And thus, here comes my cravings. Here comes my appetite. All of a sudden, even though I may not have physically done anything different because of the stress, right? I didn't run away from or swim away from the threat. I just experienced it, and now I need to eat something.
So interestingly, when we talk about this, right? So cortisol bad. Well, in the short term, right? So if we're going to look at in the long term, in the short term, it's very beneficial. So if we have an acute stress, then your adrenals secrete cortisol. Then that tells increased glucose for the muscles, especially the heart rate, and you never almost get in an accident. You're like, whew, all right, wow, I'm buzzing now, right? Then you're going to inhibit insulin because you don't want to store that excess energy, and then your fight or flight, cortisol epinephrine happens, the acute stress is resolved, and then your hormone levels normalize, right? Which is what we want. But in the elevated cortisol effect, or now the fact that your body doesn't even produce it anymore because it's now in an insulinogenic state because it's just been chronically stressed out over all of these megalodons chasing you around all the time. You're going to have chronic stress, which then hypersecrete cortisol, which increase the blood supply, which suppress the adiponectin, which is normally positive to insulin sensitivity, which is the opposite of insulin resistance. So it's going to affect the ability of the cell to use the glucose. You're going to then further insulin resistance. You're going to overproduce insulin from the pancreas if it hasn't given up already. And then you're going to end up with, again, metabolic syndrome leading to diabetes, heart disease, et cetera.
Yeah, inflammation, increased inflammation all throughout the tissues of the body.
100%.
So then when we start looking at like, how do we kind of restore that balance? What does that look like? We can start connecting the dots there between the visceral fat and the excess weight and the signs and symptoms of insulin resistance, et cetera, et cetera.
So when we talk about insulin resistance, right, and I had mentioned this earlier, cortisol and its effect. So sleep, stress, food. The traditional model, and the research shows, is insulin resistance then leads to hyperinsulinemia, which then leads to beta cell dysfunction, which then leads to, let's say, metabolic disease or type 2 diabetes. Well, the alternate model, which is high levels of insulin due to a disrupted cortisol stress response, then leads to insulin resistance, which then leads to beta cell dysfunction in the pancreas, which then leads to metabolic syndrome and blood sugar issues. What we've found, and what I've personally found, is that alternate model, which is now being discovered and uncovered more in research, is much more accurate to what happens on a physiological level than the traditional, you're just eating too much model. Now, in today's world, the obesogenic world we live in, right? The high, ultra-refined, ultra-processed foods, calorie-dense foods, convenience of it, yeah, that all plays a part of it as well.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a kind of an elephant in the room with this, which is, well, what are some things that can spike cortisol? A stress response, a high intensity workout, like an F45, an emotional stress,
Disrupted sleep.
Disrupted sleep. Guess what? Fasting too. Uh-oh. Whoa.
Caloric restriction.
Caloric restriction. Yeah. Just decreasing calories.
Yeah. Caloric surplus. High levels of caloric surplus can do the same thing.
Overconsumption or underconsumption. Well, what the hell do I do with all that information? That doesn't sound very positive.
Yeah.
So if the goal is to balance and reset rhythms, right? Because cortisol is on a diurnal rhythm, meaning it's pulsatile throughout the day. It should be higher in the morning to wake you up. And it should have a nice, gentle curve, kind of like picture it like, trying to think of a visual now.
A ski slope?
Like a ski slope. Yeah. That's exactly it. And then it should bottom out slowly at the end of the day, level out. And then you rest. And as you hit the early morning hours, boom, it wakes you up and we get on this rhythm.
That's what we want.
Again. So if fasting increases cortisol in the short term, then what is the cost benefit of adopting a fasting lifestyle? Because we've seen this thousands of times over in our own life, my blood work, my lab work, my cortisol levels,
your relationship and history with sleep, and cortisol levels,
my weight loss, my ability to handle stress. Well, here's the beauty of it. And then we're going to talk about how you can improve your cortisol. Well, guess what? One of the ways you can do that is through fasting. And you're like, wait a minute. Didn't you just tell me that fasting increases cortisol in the short term? Right, Tommy? There were a couple of studies that we looked at. That showed that it was really cool because in the beginning, it was a short term. It was more elevated than, let's just say, a caloric restriction.
Yeah.
But it came back down to normal levels within just a couple of weeks.
Yeah, we hear it a lot. Like, doesn't fasting increase cortisol levels, or doesn't it put a short-term stressor on the body?
That's what we say. Yes.
Yeah, and absolutely yes, it does. A reduced calorie diet puts a stressor on the HPA axis, increased cortisol levels. A very low calorie diet does that even more, and then fasting does it even more. But these are all temporary. And that's a cool thing, because if you are maintaining weight, maintaining caloric intake, and then all of a sudden you start a new diet, and this could be a new fasting program as well, you're going to see an immediate rise in cortisol levels where the body's going through an adjustment period. But the cool thing is, if you go into those studies that looked at that and you start looking past the 2 to 3 week mark, you see a return back to the baseline, to the normal levels. And so that's the cool thing here, is that's a temporary kind of blip. And I'm also going to say that the juice is going to be worth the squeeze, but expecting that lack of balance right there in the short term is definitely beneficial, because one of the things that can lead to or be seen as is a disruption of sleep, which can also push some people away from fasting whenever they first start out, right?
This is something we hear too, is like, man, I just did an overnight fast, or I just started fast. Man, my sleep was terrible last night. Well, what it does, and there was a cool study that showed this, is that it shifted the morning cortisol to later in the day, but only in the short term.
Yeah.
So normally the first 2 or 3 times you do it, it will shift, but then the benefit comes from the lowered level of insulin. So the fact that we are going to lower levels of insulin, burn through the short-term energy stores, that's going to increase the effect of GLP-1 and, which you've heard about, these Wegovy's and Ozempics, when you break your fast. And it's going to allow you to increase your insulin sensitivity when you do go back to eat. So how does that happen? Well, we've got insulin, we've got cortisol, and we've mentioned the HPA axis, right? So that's the cascade: hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenals. That cascade tells the adrenals to release the cortisol. Then the cortisol goes and does all the other stuff that we talked about, right? And then we've got insulin. Well, let's go up level one mechanism. Let's look at the hippocampus.
Okay. So we're in the brain. Deep
we're in the brain.
Yeah.
We're in the brain. And insulin and its effect on the hippocampus, which is ultimately going to affect or direct. It's kind of like the picture of the marionette, the puppeteer with the strings.
Yeah.
To tell the HPA axis what to do.
The puppet master. Okay.
In a normal insulinemia state, so normal insulin, right? Well, first of all, insulin can cross the blood-brain barrier and directly affect the hippocampus.
Wow.
And the hippocampus has inhibitory control over the HPA axis, preventing excess cortisol release.
Okay.
So insulin goes to the brain in a normal insulinemic state, meaning normal insulin levels, tells the hippocampus, hey, don't do too much of this over here because we know too much cortisol long-term is not good.
Yeah, and this is part of that counterbalance effect that we talked about earlier in the conversation, insulin and cortisol.
So the cortisol then has a negative feedback on the HPA activity and a positive feedback on the hippocampus. So it says, yes, got it. This is great. Thank you. And it shuts down the production of that stress response, right? And that's how we get back to a normal hormone level.
Cool. Yeah. Perfect.
In hyperinsulinemic conditions, meaning high levels of insulin.
Okay. So if we're gaining weight, or if we're insulin resistant, or if we're taking medications that produce higher levels of insulin,
or if we're eating 3 meals a day plus snacks.
Yep.
Right. We're going to have higher levels of insulin because you're going to eat and then your blood sugar is going to, okay, well, I need some insulin here. So in a high insulin condition, the inhibitory activity of the hippocampus, so the puppeteer on the HPA axis, is decreased. So it releases the brake.
Yeah, cut the brakes.
So the homeostatic set point, that balance that we have, the predetermined level of the HPA axis, your stress response driver, will change. So cortisol secretion, the level of cortisol over that 24 hours increases compared to when insulin is normal, thereby inducing a state of functional hypercortisolism, which is high levels of cortisol. Well, we know that's bad. But in the high insulin state, the exaggerated cortisol secretion during the 24 hours is going to hit the gas to the HPA axis and reduce the sensitivity of that axis to the negative feedback of cortisol, telling it, hey, stop making us. Stop. I don't need any more of you. So, does fasting increase cortisol in the short term? Yes, it does. But the benefit of decreasing insulin to lower levels where insulin is no longer at normal or lower far outweighs that short-term cortisol spike or negative feedback loop.
It's absolutely required to get the insulin levels lower.
You have to get off the crazy train, right?
Yeah, you can't restore the balance in that HPA axis, in that cortisol loop, without decreasing the levels of insulin. So that has to happen. And which is exactly what we see as soon as we start to fast.
And looking at this graph, in the normal insulin, it goes up. Cortisol is on the vertical axis. It goes up sharp and then comes down relatively normal, kind of like a ski slope, right? I'd say like I don't know, not a black diamond, a more aggressive pitch.
Okay.
But in the high insulin state, the baseline is double for cortisol already. Then it goes up slightly higher.
So the peak is higher too, and the
peak
baseline
is slightly
was double.
higher.
Yeah,
but the baseline's way higher, and then it comes down like a bunny trail.
So that means the area under the curve is way higher.
Massive.
Yeah. Wow.
So, what the heck is the takeaway? How do you improve your cortisol levels?
Well, we have to plan for more than just a couple of days or a
Right.
week of fasting, right? Like
It's not going to be fixed overnight. What are you talking about?
no, the problem didn't happen overnight. It's not going to be fixed overnight. Even if it feels like, it should be like, oh man. So expectations versus reality here. But what it also means, I think, is that we need to plan for some consistency with timing, especially in the beginning, like starting off, going at it strategically, systematically, with consistency in mind is important, because less consistency means, hey, as
more volatility.
More volatility for sure. As my meal timings are more erratic and they're all over the place, then that means sleep-wake cycle is disturbed more. And we know that that's an important lever here too. So if we introduce some consistency and maybe just do the same thing for a few days or maybe a week or so before we change it, and before we just start changing everything, that means I can get some consistency in my sleep-wake cycle, which is then gonna help the insulin and cortisol balance and my HPA axis right there.
I want to say one more thing about the HPA axis, right? The stress response axis in obesity and metabolic syndrome. We hear this often: don't lose the weight too quick. Well, if we're stuck, right, with the excess weight, with the chronic low inflammation, with the disrupted cortisol response and a higher insulinogenic state, we know that the brake lines have been cut. We got a what's that movie with Keanu Reeves?
Yeah, Speed. Yeah, we got the bus. Yeah, we're just
movie
cruising.
Does not translate to today. It's so bad.
We can't stop it, but we can stop it. Well, we need a new set of brakes, like
right. So there's some studies here that prove the total daily cortisol production is enhanced in obesity and metabolic syndrome. And it's the direct correlation is that the HPA axis responsiveness in obesity, particularly here it is, when there's visceral obesity, visceral adiposity, that was enhanced to stimuli such as acute stress, megalodons everywhere, imbalanced blood sugar, and a standard meal. Crap. So even if you're making food changes and you're like, I'm eating clean, I'm doing things.
Yeah, it might not be enough at that point.
Your HPA axis and your visceral fat's going, right? Like the character from The Simpsons. What's his name? Where he makes fun of Bart. Like that really annoying.
Yeah, the bully. Bully. Yeah.
Yeah.
Martin?
No. Martin. No.
I don't know.
Martin's the soft-spoken
yeah, he eats
nerdy
or something, right? Yeah. Man, I don't know. It's been too long, but when we're looking at a method to actually do this, yeah, I mean, it might just be
that's where I was going.
Bucket. It might just be a drop in the bucket.
Get the freaking weight off. Right? Let's use fasting. Take the short-term cortisol negative, but take the long-term benefit. Get the weight off.
Yeah.
Stop the runaway bus in speed.
Right.
Get some tape on those brake lines.
We need it. We need it like yesterday. We got to get it. Yeah. And so, I mean, how do we kind of ramp up? How do we ramp into that? How do we transition into it? I know I mentioned the insulin assessment earlier in the conversation. I'm going to shamelessly plug the blueprint to fasting for fat loss right here. Like
for consistent fasting efforts. For
consistency.
Yes.
Get into it, ramp up, get some consistency, get some reps under your belt. And then even as you have that, like if you're just getting started or you're getting back into it, you might have that increased cortisol response in the beginning.
Because you might feel a little jittery, you might feel antsy, your sleep might be a little disturbed.
Yeah, that's okay.
It's okay.
Yeah. It's not a reason to shy away from it. It's just a reason to go, okay. It just takes a little bit of time right here.
It actually says, to me, it says prioritize sleep even more.
100%.
Which is one of your notes from our pre-show prep. So I just stole your thunder.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, I've forgotten about that one, but it's an important one because I mean, I would say the longer the fast is, also the more important the sleep is. Right. But the more you're just starting out, or the more you're getting back onto fasting consistency, the the more important the sleep is. But here's the cool thing too. If sleep is one of your big issues, what I would do there is start with an earlier dinner, or start cutting off, that time restricted eating later in the day, because then you're going to automatically put some good boundaries that help you with sleep right there, rather than thinking, man, I just need a longer fast. Well, maybe you just need a little bit earlier meal, and that might be really, really helpful. It might be more helpful than what you're thinking right there.
100%.
Yeah.
So let's speak directly to cortisol.
Okay.
And a lot of these things apply to blood sugar, right? Because cortisol, blood sugar, insulin relationship.
Mm-hmm.
We talked at length today about the fact that, cortisol itself impairs insulin signaling, can lead to high blood sugar levels in the blood short term, decrease in GLP-1, which is none of the things that we want long term. It's great to get away from the megalodon, what was it? The
Mastodon.
Yeah.
Both. Get away from both.
Right. Pick one. So how can we directly improve your cortisol? So it's lifestyle changes. And this is why it's called fasting for life, right? That's why we adopt the fasting lifestyle. Well, we talk more about lifestyle than we do fasting inside of our coaching and inside of our challenges. Cause it's like, yeah, you got the schedule, now go do it. But it's all the other stuff that gets in your way. So things you can do to improve your cortisol levels: meditation, right? Right out the gate, increase mindfulness, decrease levels of cortisol. Find one that works for you. It doesn't matter. Like, meditation's weird to me, right? I still suck at it, but it's a practice of meditation, right?
Yeah.
I'm not some Buddhist monk, right?
Yeah.
So just go find a guided meditation that you like. Find an app, but consistently do it. There's a cool device called HeartMath, right? Where it measures your heart coherence. That's a great way to do it. We already talked about focusing on sleep. Stay active, but here's a caveat. Don't always overdo it. Don't always do the high intensity boot camp F45. Like, start to walk, do some low intensity, steady state workouts, right? Yeah. Because regular moderate exercise 3 to 4 times a week, like strength training or brisk walking, is better than always just crushing your cortisol levels and your adrenals at 5 a.m. Because that's the only time you're going to get your workout in, right? I used to go to CrossFit early in the morning, and I would literally crash and go sleep in the car before I went to see patients. Yeah,
because you were underslept to make that early morning workout too, and then pushed it, and
over cortisoled and over insulined, and yeah, and I get it. I get the drive to do that as well, and it's okay. It's okay sometimes, but don't make it all the time, right? Let's put some balance in there so we can prioritize sleep and reduce the strain on the HPA axis too. Yep. And then get outside. This is why I do my walks. I hate walking. Ask my wife. That's why I do them. I'm actually starting to appreciate it now. Like, I look forward to them, like midday walks in the Texas heat. Love it. That's cool. Right. Studies show that 10 minutes in nature 3 times a week, cortisol levels drop. Right.
Well, I believe it.
Watch a funny movie, listen to a funny podcast, right? Laughter lowers cortisol by about 1/3.
Nice.
Right? Incredible. And then get around people you care about. Phone a friend, like the old Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, right?
Yeah.
Phone a friend. Call your parents. Talk to your spouse.
Join a Facebook community like ours.
Yeah. I see what you did there. I'm just full of shameless plugs today. I like it.
Hey, when it fits, it fits.
It does. It's true. Yeah. It's true. It's like the cat memes, right? If I fit, I sit, right? Cats sitting in all these random objects.
Exactly.
My daughter's in love with cats. I'm so glad that I'm deathly allergic to them.
Oh man. Always have a good excuse on the ready.
Right?
Yeah.
So as we wrap up today, lots of good action steps. Our goal is to always give you 1 or 2 things that you can do. So maybe it's more consistent fasting. Maybe it's focusing on your sleep. Maybe it's doing some of these cortisol balancing or lowering activities. But just know that, if you're looking for additional support, head to the Facebook group, join a challenge. You want to accelerate your results, come on in. The water's warm. We'll take you through a guided 7-day experience. And just excited that, in the world where there's tons of talk about cortisol and how bad it is, we need it to live, but then we also don't need it to be constantly elevated due to all the megalodons and mastodons and stressors that we have in today's world. So, Tommy, I appreciate the conversation, sir. want you guys to pick one or two things that resonated with you. Go do it now, unless you're driving, of course. Go do one or two things today that will improve your long-term goals or your long-term fasting position. Wish you all the best, sir. Talk to you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
So, you've heard today's episode, and you may be wondering, where do I start? Head on over to thefastingforlife.com and sign up for our newsletter, where you'll receive fasting tips and strategies to maximize results and fit fasting into your day-to-day life.
While you're there, download your free Fast Start guide to get started today. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review, and we'll be back next week with another episode of Fasting for Life.